Sir Ranulph Fiennes, Britain's last great adventurer, tells of his struggle for life in the Arctic Circle.
The cold numbs you and you die in a fairly pleasant fashion, really.
Hello and welcome to It Happened to Me. Sir Ranulph Fiennes is Britain's most famous explorer. For 30 years he set himself seemingly impossible goals. Recently, Ran attempted to be the first person to walk by himself to the North Pole by the most difficult route. The enormity of the challenge almost cost him his life. For the first time, Ran tells the full story of this extraordinary adventure.
Everybody who had to do with this expedition knew that the percentage of success was very remote. I mean, if it wasn't remote, somebody would have done it previously, because the world's best have tried and failed. Mike Stroud, the co-organizer of the expedition, one of the world's top polar experts, gave it a 20% chance of success, which means that somebody, sooner or later, is definitely going to do it, slip through on the 20%. And so I could be that person.
Ran, in these last few minutes, what's going through your mind? Any last-minute thoughts that this is foolhardy?
Some people might think that, yeah. And of course, the nearer you get to it, the more you're inclined to join them.
There are two routes to the North Pole. If you were God looking down at the North Pole, you'd see a circle of land going around the ocean. And one side of the circle is Russia, and the other side of the circle is North America and Canada. If you set out from the Russian side, you will eventually, on the ice floes, reach the pole, because all the ice floes are gradually being drifted towards the North Pole. So it took long enough, you'd get there without much work. It's called the drift route. That's been done. The difficult route, which has not been done because it is difficult, is to get to the North Pole from the North American side. And in order to reach the pole, you are travelling against this moving ice. So shall we say, for example, that you're halfway to the pole and you sleep. You look at the GPS when you go to sleep, and you look at it again when you wake up the following morning, and you find to your horror that you've actually lost 7 miles overnight by your ice being drifted and your tent back the way you've come. It's like a treadmill.
Ran started off strongly, but soon the hazards of going it alone began to show.
I got to a wall about 15 foot high, which I went over, 15 foot, no real problem, 45-degree slope. And when I got to the top, I heard a slight rumble, and I looked behind me to see that the sledge was sliding off. So I jumped after it, caught the back, and was pulled over. It wasn't a 45 degrees on that side, it was sheer. So we fell 15 feet. I was winded, but okay. The sledge, however, fell with its 300-pound load onto a sharp rock of ice, which dented its underneath, which was pretty bad. I've never had that before in all the years. And so I had to try and repair it.
To repair the damaged sledge, Ran had to haul it back to an abandoned hut near the point where he'd started out. It took him more than a day.
This is the hut. It's probably about minus 49 degrees. That is the heater, which I've tried to make work. It won't work. And I have got my own camp cooker going on the bench. This is the sledge.
The sledge had a long tear in its plastic hull, which Ran managed to smooth out and patch. He set off again, but the accident was an omen of worse problems ahead, and soon nature once more fought back.
I got to an area where a whole lot of ice slabs had come together, rather like if you're going to lay a new lawn, you have little bits of grass slabs. Well, these, if you can imagine them being made of ice, had all come together and they were all piled up 10 foot high. So the only way over was to try and go over this pile of moving slabs. But when I was on the top and moving over the ridge, a slide started, and some of the bits slid into the water, and my sledge started sliding sideways, and I found myself being pulled down the slope towards the water. I managed to grab with one hand a ice block which wasn't moving, by which time one of my feet was in the water and the sledge had splashed into the water, and I was trying to get the sledge rope out, but it was quite clear that the only way I was going to do that was to get my hand underwater, underneath, find the snag and pull it out. And I did unsnag it, but unfortunately it took, I don't know, 2 minutes or something to do. So my hand had begun to get a bit cold. It's probably -5 underwater. But the problem began when I got the sledge out of the water, and as soon as it was on the safe flat, I instantly started to do the blood revival technique, which any person who has experience in that area would do, which is to windmill your hand viciously so that at the outside of the sort of centrifugal force, the blood goes back down into your fingers. But this time, in that hand, the blood simply did not respond. It did not go back into the hand. I then took the mitt off, got the mitt off and felt it, and the fingers were solid. I mean, it was as though there were sticks on my hand. As you've got these things happening to you, I suppose you're sort of thinking, oh dear, you know, I'm in real trouble. But you just mustn't let that become a conscious thought in the front of your thoughts, because there isn't time. It'll delay you in doing something sensible. And if you don't do something sensible, then the deteriorating circumstances will get too far, in which case you definitely will die.
Ran knew only quick thinking would save his life. With the temperature approaching -50, he could quickly freeze to death.
So I realized that I would have to put the tent up. Not only put the tent up, but get a cooker started. It's a petrol cooker. So you're in quite a tricky situation. The tent, a one-man tent, is tiny, so that in between the cooker and the flammable roof there's not much room. I had put a special flame-proof layer over the area where I hoped to use the cooker, which was lucky, because I couldn't get the primus going. I used my teeth, which burnt the inside of my mouth, and I mean the cold burn, and managed to get the petrol through into the priming pad, but couldn't turn it off quickly enough, so too much petrol went through. I couldn't get the lighter to work. By now my hands are almost gone. I found some matches. I put one in my mouth and lit it, managed to get the petrol going, and the petrol singed my eyebrows and completely removed the flame-proof layer, but not the tent. I'm pretty near frozen, but the cooker actually got going, and that was it. That was, I don't know if I'd been back if the cooker hadn't got going. If the other hand went, I would have not died for at least 2 hours. Maybe I could have kept going somehow with the stumps for 6 hours, perhaps. It wouldn't have been pleasant hours, but there are very unpleasant ways of dying compared with the cold. The cold numbs you, and you die in a fairly pleasant fashion, really. There's a chance that panic can set in, and desperation. And that's when you've got to manage to focus on each tiny act, like, where is the matchbox? You know, how can I do this without spilling all the matches in the snow? 3 hours later, I was not shaking anymore, and I realized I was going to have to get back to somewhere, because we're talking amputation by now. I knew the expedition had ceased, because you don't try and do something with a dead hand. And so it was a question of whether I would actually survive.
Ran was struggling for his life. His only chance was to trek back to the abandoned hut, where he could assemble his radio equipment and call for help. At the expedition's communications centre in Scotland, his team were already concerned.
The clock was running for us. The clock was running, and we were looking at our watches, and I was getting concerned about the fact that we hadn't heard any signals from him whatsoever. The safety protocol says if we don't hear anything for 36 hours, we attempt to get him. Within 36 hours, he'd probably be dead anyway.
Finally, Ran reached the hut and rigged up a radio mast.
it took a very long time to get back to the hut. You were going uphill and it's soft snow, and by then I was in a very bad state with a lot of sort of pain, and it was a great thing seeing the hut.
This is the shortwave radio that Ran actually used on the expedition here, that can communicate 3,500–4,000 kilometres back to our station in Scotland, near Aberdeen. And he told me in a broken voice, which I'd never heard Ran talk before in a broken voice, he said to me that he only just made it. Now for Ran to say that, that means something. He's never said that to me before. We've been in some very nasty scrapes, and that's the first time I've heard him say that. I don't know, Flo, he says that I only just made it. I thought, gee, he must be in a bad way. And he was. He was close, probably, to losing his life, I would think. I contacted my ex-wife, Morag, who runs the airbase up in northern Canada. Luckily enough, the weather held, and it was good. And the aircraft got into him around about local midday the next day.
I lit some kerosene rags at the end of a 300 yards of straight ice, and the pilot, wonderful guy, managed to land, and I got back in. And from then on, it was hospitals. Those people who like to find a sort of criticism would say, well, the fellow was 56, of course he's going to fail. So why did I do it? What is the point? You lose your fingers. Well, I'd infinitely preferred to have tried doing expeditions, always with the risk of something going wrong and always with the risk of something happening to your body, than not to have done it. So for groups like our own expedition group, who only specialize in things which haven't ever been done before, we find ourselves doing things which are extremely difficult, and therefore our chances of failure are very great. But when we do succeed, we have completed something which is historic.
A remarkable man. Sadly, Sir Ranulph will have to have parts of all of his fingers on his left hand amputated. We wish him well for a good recovery. Now next, what's it like to go on an expedition yourself? And how do you go to the toilet at 20 below zero? Find out in part 2.
I've just realised I've dropped Turi's body moisturiser in the toilet. I'm not quite sure what to do.